Hi there, and welcome to the Cory Doctorow podcast. I hope you had a weekend that was every bit as good as mine. It was a beautiful sunny spring weekend here in London, and it was my wife's birthday. So on Friday afternoon, we both knocked off work early and went to a hotel in town. And my daughter was picked up from daycare by her godmom. We spent the night with her, and we got to go to a movie. We saw Coraline. It was fantastic. We got to go out for a lovely dinner of dim sum. We got to sleep in the next morning and have breakfast in bed, and then have coffee from the Monmouth Coffee Shop, which is my favorite coffee in all of London, if not the whole world. And the day just got better from there. We did some shopping. We The next day we went and swam in the pool, and then I took the kid to the farm, little city farm here in Hackney, and boy, it was just fantastic. Couldn't ask for a better one. And there's a nice week lined up ahead of me. I have more or less knocked off all the niggling freelance writing assignments that were kind of backed up for me, which is nice. And I'm ready to start work on a couple of short stories in addition to the novels. So I've got the novel now in the downhill stretch here. And I think I might have mentioned that I'm going to do this story for Jonathan Strahan's anthology about Mars, and I'm going to do a story called The Martian Chronicles, naturally. And I've got that plotted out, and I think there's going to be a graphic novel of it too. I'm still negotiating with a comics press about it, but they're very excited about it. I'm very excited about it. It's all going very well. And I've also agreed to write a short story for Frederick Pohl's anthology. This is an anthology called Gateways of stories in honor of Frederick Pohl. Pohl, of course, is one of the grand old men of the field, and I think I've got the whole story nailed down. It was one of the nice things about having a day off to play grown up with my wife, is that I got to do some thinking without baby interruptions for a little while. And I came up with a story called Chicken Little that's going to be loosely based on the Space Merchants. So both of those I've got kind of in the queue and really excited about. I'm going to start work on Chicken Little tomorrow. On Wednesday, I'm off to Oslo in Norway, where I'm going to be talking to NRK. That's the national broadcaster in Norway. They've asked me to come in and talk about open content. I love talking about open content, and Norway is just fantastic at this time of year. And I'm particularly looking forward to going to a science fiction bookstore in Norway, because they've got it all. The science fiction bookstores in Norway are amazing because they're science fiction, heavy metal, goth, Dungeons and Dragons, comics, video game, Emporia. They kind of merge all of the subcultures. It's like if you took 1/10 of every table in the dealer's room at a Worldcon and put them all in one building, you'd get the Oslo science fiction store. So looking forward to popping in at one of those. Anyway, that's enough of me. Now let's get down to the point of the podcast. My 2005 novel, Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town. I've never been to the doctor's, she said. Never had a pap smear or been felt for lumps. Never ever had an x-ray. Feel this, she said, and put her upper arm before his face. He took it and ran his fingertips over it, finding a hard bump halfway along, opposite her fleshy bicep. What's this? He said. That's how a bone sets if you have a bad break and you don't get a cast. Crooked. Jesus, he said, giving it another squeeze. Now that he knew what it was, he thought, or perhaps fancied, that he could feel how the unevenly splintered pieces of bones mated together, met at a slight angle, and fused together by the knitting process. She made me a sling, and she fed me every meal and brushed my teeth. I had to stop her from following me into the toilet to wipe me up. And I didn't care. She could have broken both of my arms if she'd only explained the photos to me, or left them with me so that I could go on investigating them, but she did neither. She hardly spoke a word to me. She resettled herself against the pillows, then pulled him back against her, and plumped his head against her breasts. Are you falling in love with me? She said. He startled. The way she said it, it didn't sound like a young adult. She sounded like a small child. Mimi, he began, and then stopped himself. I don't think so. I mean, I like you. Good, she said. No falling in love, all right? Auntie died 6 months later. She keeled over on the staircase on her way up to the apartment, and I heard her moaning and thrashing out there. I hauled her up the stairs with my good arm, and she crawled along on her knees, making gargling noises. I laid her out on the rug in the living room. I tried to get her up on the sofa, but I couldn't budge her. So I gave her pillows from the sofa and water, and then I tried tea, but she couldn't take it. She threw up once, and I soaked it up with a tea towel that had fussy roses on it. She took my hand, and her grip was weak, her strong hand suddenly thin and shaky. It took her an hour to die. When she died, she made a rasping, rattling sound, and then she shat herself. I could smell it. It was all I could smell as I sat there in the little apartment, 6 years old, hot as hell outside and stuffy inside. I opened the windows and watched the chassids walk past. I felt like I should do something for the old lady, but I didn't know what. I formulated a plan. I would go outside and bring in some grown-up to take care of the old lady. I would go to the grocery store and eat sandwiches until I was 12, at which point I would be grown up and I would get a job fixing television. I marched into my room and changed into my best clothes, the little Alice blue dress I wore to dinner on Sundays, and I brushed my hair and put on my socks with the blue pom-poms at the ankles and found my shoes in the hall closet. But it had been 3 years since I'd last worn the shoes, and I could barely fit 3 toes in them. The old lady's shoes were so big I could fit both feet in either one. I took off my socks. Sometimes I'd seen kids going by barefoot outside, but never just in socks, and reached for the doorknob. I touched it. I stopped. I turned around again. There was a stain forming under Auntie, piss and shit and death juice, and as I looked at her I had a firm sense that it wouldn't be right to bring people up to her apartment with her like this. I'd seen dead people on TV. They were propped up on pillows in clean hospital nighties with rouged cheeks. I didn't know how far I could get, but I thought I owed it to her to try. I figured it was better than going outside. She was lighter in depth, as though something had fled her. I could drag her into the bathroom and prop her on the edge of the tub. I needed to wash her before anyone else came up. I cut away her dress with the sewing shears. She was wearing an elastic girdle beneath, an enormous brassiere, and they were too tough or too tight to cut through, so I struggled with their hooks, each one going spung as I unhooked it, revealing red skin beneath it, pinched and sore-looking. When I got to her bra, I had a moment's pause. She was a modest person. I'd never even seen her legs without tan compression hose, but the smell was overwhelming, and I just held to that vision of her in a nightie and clean sheets and, went for it. Popped the hooks. Felt it give way as her breasts forced it off her back. Found myself staring at 2 little wings, the size of my thumbs, bent and cramped, broken, folded, there over her shoulder blades. I touched them and they were cold and hard as a turkey neck I'd once found in the trash after she'd made soup with it. How did you get out? With my wings? Yeah, with your wings and with no shoes and with the old lady dead in the tub. She nuzzled his neck, then bit it, then kissed it, then bit it again, brushed her fingers over his nipples. I don't know, she breathed, hot in his ear. He arched his back. You don't know? I don't know. That's all I remember for 5 years. He arched his back again and raked his fingertips over her thighs, making her shudder and jerk her wings back. That's when he saw the corpse at the foot of the bed. It was George. He went back to school the day after they buried Davy. He bathed all the brothers in the hot spring and got their teeth brushed, and he fed them a hot breakfast of boiled mushroom and jerky stew, and he gathered up their school books from the forgotten corners of the winter cave and put them into school bags. Then he led them down the hillside on a spring day that smelled wonderful, loam and cold water coursing down the mountainside in rivulets, and new grass and new growth drying out in hard white sun that seemed directly overhead 5 minutes after it rose. They held hands as they walked down the hill, and then Elliot, Frankie, George broke away and ran down the hill to the roadside, skipping over the stones and holding their belly as they flew down the hillside. Alan laughed at the impatient jig they danced as they waited for him and Brad to catch up, and Brad put an arm around his shoulder and kissed him on the cheek in a moment of uncharacteristic demonstrativeness. He marched right into Mr. Davenport's office with his brothers in tow. "We're back," he said. Mr. Davenport peered at them over the tops of his glasses. "You are you?" "Mom took sick," he said. "Very sick. We had to go live with our aunt, and she was too far away for us to get to school." "I see," Mr. Davenport said. "I taught the littler ones as best as I could," Alan said. He liked Mr. Davenport, understood him. He had a job to do and needed everything to be accounted for and filed away. It was okay for Alan and his brothers to miss months of school, provided that they had a good excuse when they came back. Alan could respect that. "And I read ahead in my textbooks," he said. "I think we'll be okay." "I'm sure you will be," Mr. Davenport said. "And how is your mother now?" "She's better," he said, "but she was very sick. In the hospital." "What was she sick with?" Alan hadn't thought this far ahead. He knew how to lie to adults, but he was out of practice. "Cancer," he said, thinking of Marcy's mother. "Cancer," Mr. Davenport said, staring hard at him. "But she's better now," Alan said. "I see. You boys, why don't you get to class? Alan, please wait here a moment." His brothers filed out of the room, and Alan shuffled nervously, looking at the class ring on Mr. Davenport's hairy finger and remembering that time Davy had kicked him. He'd never asked Alan where Davy was after that, and Alan had never offered, and it had been as though they shared a secret. "Are you all right, Alan?" he asked, sitting down behind his desk, taking off his glasses. "Yes, sir," Alan said. "You're getting enough to eat at home. There's a quiet place where you can work." "Yes," Alan said, squirming. "It's fine now that Mom is home." "I see," Mr. Davenport said. "Listen to me, son," he said, putting his hands flat on the desk. "The school district has some resources available. Clothes, lunch vouchers, Big Brother programs. They're not anything you have to be ashamed of. It's not charity, it's just a little booster. A little bit of help. The other children, their parents are well and they live in town and they have lots of advantages that you and your brothers lack. This is just how we level the playing field. You're a very bright lad and your brothers are growing up well, but it's no sin to accept a little help." Alan suddenly felt like laughing. "We're not underprivileged," he said, thinking of the mountain and the feeling of being encompassed by the love of his father, of the flakes of soft, lustrous gold the golems produced by the handful. "We're very well off," he said, thinking of home, now free of Davy and his hateful, spiteful anger. "Thank you, though," he said, thinking of his life unfolding before him, free from the terror of Davy's bites and spying and rocks thrown from afar. Mr. Davenport scowled and stared hard at him. Alan met his stare and smiled. "It's time for classes," he said. "Can I go?" "Go," Mr. Davenport said. He shook his head. "But remember, you can always come here if you have anything you want to talk to me about." "I'll remember," Alan said. 6 years later, Bradley was big and strong, and he was the star goalie of all the hockey teams in town, in front of the puck before it arrived, making desperate, almost nonchalant saves that had them howling in the stands, stomping their feet, sloshing their Tim Hortons coffee over the bleachers to freeze into brown ice. In the summer, he was the star pitcher on every softball team, and the girls trailed after him like a long comet tail after the games when he and the other players led him away to a park to drink illicit beers. Alan watched the games from afar with his schoolbooks on his lap, and Eric Franz Gregg nearby playing trucks or reading or gnawing on a sucker. By the ninth inning or the final period, the young ones would be too tired to play, and they'd come and lean heavily against Alan, like a bag of lead pressing on him, eyes half open, and Alan would put an arm around them and feel at one with the universe. It snowed on the afternoon of the season opener for the town softball league that year. Fat, white flakes that kissed your cheeks and melted away in an instant, so soft you weren't sure they'd been there at all. Bradley caught up with Alan on their lunch break at the cafeteria in the high school 2 blocks from the elementary school. He had his mitt with him and a huge grin. "You planning on playing through the snow?" Alan said as he set down his cheeseburger and stared out the window at the diffuse white radiance of the April noontime bouncing off the flakes. It'll be gone by tonight. Gonna be warm, Bradley said, and nodded at his jock buddies sitting at their long table, sucking down cokes and staring at the girls. Gonna be a good game. I know it. Bradley knew. He knew when they were getting shorted at the assayers when they brought in the golem's gold, just as he knew that showing up for lunch with a brown bag full of dried squirrel jerky and mushrooms and lemongrass was a surefire way to end up social roadkill in the high school hierarchy, as was dressing like someone who'd been caught in an explosion at the Salvation Army. And so now he had money, and he had a burger, and he had a pair of narrow-leg jeans from the Gap, and a Roots sweatshirt, and a Stussy baseball hat, and Reebok sneakers, and he looked basically like a real person. Alan couldn't say the same for himself, but he'd been making an effort ever since Bradley got to high school, if only to save his brother the embarrassment of being related to the biggest reject in the building. But Alan still managed to exude his don't fuck with me aura enough that no one tried to cozy up to him to make friends with him and scrutinize his persona close in, which was just what he wanted. Bradley watched a girl walk past, a cute thing with red hair and freckles and a skinny, raw-boned look, and Alan remembered that she'd been sitting next to him in class for going on 2 years now, and he'd never bothered to learn her name. And he'd never bothered to notice that she was a dead ringer for Marcy. I've always had a thing for redheads, Bradley said, because of you, he said. You and your girlfriend, I mean. If she was good enough for you, well, that she had to be the epitome of sophistication and sexiness. Back then, you were like a god to me, and she was like a goddess. I imprinted on her, like the baby ducks in Bio. It's amazing how much of who I am today I can trace back to those days. Who knew it was all so important? He was a smart kid, introspective without being moody, integrated, always popping off these fine little observations in between his easy jokes. The girls adored him, the boys admired him, the teachers were grateful for him and the way he bridged the gap between scholarship and athleticism. I must have been a weird kid, he said, all that quiet. You were a great kid, Alan said. It was a lot of fun back then, mostly. Mostly, he said. They both stared at the girl, who noticed them now and blushed and looked confused. Bradley looked away, but Alvin held his gaze on her, and she whispered to a friend who looked at him, and they both laughed, and then Alan looked away too, sorry that he'd inadvertently interacted with his fellow students. He was supposed to watch, not participate. He was real, Bradley said, and Alan knew he meant Davy. Yeah, Alan said. I don't think the little ones really remember him. He's more like a bad dream to them. But he was real, wasn't he? Yeah, Alan said. But he's gone now. Was it right? What do you mean, Alan said. He felt a sear of anger arc along his spine. It's nothing, Billy said, mumbling into his tray. What do you mean, Brad? Alan said. What else should we have done? How can you have any doubts? I don't, Brad said. It's okay. Alan looked down at his hands, which appeared to belong to someone else. White lumps of dough clenched into hard fists, knuckles white. He made himself unclench them. No, it's not okay. Tell me about this. You remember what he was like, what he did. I remember it, Brian said. Of course I remember it. He was staring through the table now, the look he got when he was contemplating a future the rest of them couldn't see. But Alan waited. He was trembling inside. He'd done the right thing. He'd saved his family. He knew that. But for 6 years he'd found himself turning in his memory to the little boy on the ground, holding the loops of intestine in through slippery red fingers. For 6 years, whenever he'd been somewhere quiet long enough that his own inner voices fell still, he'd remember the hair in his fist, the knife's thirsty draught as it drew forth the hot splash of blood from Davy's throat. He'd remembered the ragged fissures that opened down Clarence's length, and the way Davy fell into it. So light and desiccated he was almost weightless. If you remember it, then you know I did the right thing. I did the only thing. We did the only thing, Brian said, and covered Alan's hands with his. Alan nodded and stared at his cheeseburger. You better go catch up with your friends, he said. I love you, Adam, he said. I love you too. Billy crossed the room, nodding to the people who greeted him from every table, geeks and jocks and band and all the meaningless tribes of the high school universe. The cute redhead sprinkled a wiggle finger wink at him, and he nodded at her, the tips of his ears going pink. Well, I'll talk to you next week.